better lens at, what maybe worked or didn't work. Or we have new students, right? Students have changed over the last 7 years. And so some of their needs have also changed. So that's kind of where we were at. We were this very specialized, structured system, and we were looking at this kind of from a global lens. So we really started with that cultural beliefs and values. We identified as a district that this was something that we wanted to change. Um, then we built some teams to start supporting that work in a very targeted way. And we're going to kind of go through that. But we built an inclusive practices team. We brought on COSAs, which are classified on special assignment. So they were instructional assistants. And then we started looking at very specific schools and kind of did this in a very small baby step way, and then started kind of expanding it. Now, as we've gone through the system, there have been different tiers that have been targeted. And so kind of what Jessica described of going back to the beginning and envisioning again, right? We've done that at different layers as we've targeted maybe different school sites or different levels between secondary and elementary or preschool. And so it really is just kind of a cycle that you go through, and you might be in different stages at different times in different spaces. So I appreciate those of you that identified that we were kind of in two different spots in your own spaces. That was very representative of kind of what you would see that tool being utilized for. So we're going to kind of go through that whole blueprint stage by stage and kind of look at how SIP envisions that and kind of what that could look like. And then I'll give you some examples of what that looked like in Poway.
I gotta unmute myself. Thank you, Michelle. So our first piece of that blueprint is the envisioning. And this is that we know leaders can set a unified direction with a clear vision, mission, value, demonstrating a commitment to the transformative practices. So we really look at the elements of developing that cohesive vision, engaging those first adopters, and what would that communication of clarity and urgency of purpose be for you? So Michelle is going to unpack that a little bit for Poway.
Yeah, so one of the first things that we did was we created two different teams. So the first one was the inclusive practices team. So this was very small to start. It included a TOSA, that was a teacher on special assignment, and a COSA, so a classified on special assignment. And then with them, they would partner with the school's administrative teams and their program specialist. So some program specialists were involved in this work from the very beginning. I lucked out and was one of them. And some of them didn't get to join this work until later on, depending on when their schools kind of were going through these systems changes. The SEI advisory team was more of the leadership district level team. So that included our union representatives, it included our special ed directors, that included our associate superintendent, as well as obviously the staff on the inclusive practices team. And then it also included some board members. This was a big push from our school board. We have some amazing people that have been part of our district for a long time, both as board members and also parents. And so they were very supportive through this kind of process. And so they wanted to know what was going on. They really wanted to make sure that we were targeting this group of students and that we were doing it in a way that would last, right? That was going to go through kind of that longevity test. So that was what our SAI advisory team was. And the links in them take you to our website that kind of reviewed those teams. So if you wanted more information. And then the next step was really making sure that our LCAP goals included our students with disabilities in those visions, right? Everything kind of has to go back to the LCAP goals for a district. That kind of dictates where funds go, what teams are created, right? Staffing, what the prioritization are within the district of different initiatives. And so that was the kind of the next step. And we made sure that each LCAP goal that identified students included that demographic of students and those groups. And there were some edits made to our LCAP goals in order to ensure that they were appropriately being measured within those goals, right? And so sometimes you'll have goals that are, all students will be at XYZ level, or they will all make XYZ progress. And we acknowledge that that was not a one size fits all for all students. And so there were some nuances added. Looking back now, there were more things that we would like to go back and add and adjust because we now have more information and a better understanding of kind of how all of that works and what some of the outcomes were that we would have liked to have tracked from the beginning. But it was at least a starting point for us, right? To ensure that those students were acknowledged in the LCAP, that they had specific areas targeted for them, and that they were included in kind of all of that work as well. And that really went to, again, every area. So it wasn't just academically based. It wasn't just, graduation rates. It was about, that was a part of it. And then it was also about ensuring that those students and their families were also part of the community, right? They were part of the teams and groups that we were holding, whether it would be with our community advisory group, whether that was surveys we were sending out, right? Anything that we were trying to involve our community in, there was an extra step or an extra push to ensure that that group of students and their families were also included and their input was gathered, regarding more of that like safe environments, sense of belonging, right? Those positive relationships, and building systems for those families to participate, and encourage that participation was huge.
Thank you for that, Michelle, because that piece of grounding it in the LCAP speaks volumes to students with disabilities. Were not in a silo. They were envisioned early on in being a part of the whole school's purpose, the whole district's purpose. So awesome. And so our next piece here in building, for those of you who had said you were kind of in the building phase, this really focuses on what is our data saying to us, how are we analyzing it, and then how are we being strategic in planning for equity. When we do our goal setting, what does that look like when we have progress? How are we going to measure for that? And then identifying and re-examining any policies and practices within that piece as well. That is important. So Poway will share some of what they had done.
Yeah. So Poway is a single SELPA district. So we are fairly large in that sense. So whenever you are rolling something out, it is very difficult to roll something out right district wide. It is kind of done in phases. And so historically, something that has been utilized in this district is doing volunteers first and kind of having sites that are showing an interest or have staff that are interested, join in kind of early on and be our early adopters or volunteers. And then we kind of build from there year by year. So initially, we opened it up to the entire district. We asked for applications to become a pilot school for inclusive practices or a model school. We had multiple school sites apply kind of across all grade levels. And part of the application was that they had to draft out what they wanted their dream version of their school to look like, to embed inclusive practices for all students. It wasn't just for students with disabilities. That's kind of where we were grounding the work. But the concept behind the applications was, how do we make this better for all? We've often referred to, in this district, our students who have IEPs tend to be our canaries in the coal mine, right? If they are having a successful experience and they are having a sense of belonging and they are showing great outcomes, then the majority of our other student populations also will. And many of them are dually identified, right, into some of those other subgroups as well. And so it was kind of our way of trying to target all students through a very specific group, because if we're able to support them, then a lot of the other groups would also be supported through kind of that universal design for learning, right? Through all of those options. So once we received all their applications, we used our SA advisory team to go through all those applications. It was a very rigorous process of reviewing. We went and did observations at the school sites. We met with the staff. It was a very kind of rigorous process for those schools that wanted to be part of it. And then once they were identified, we identified one elementary, one middle, and one high school. So we had somebody at every level. Our belief at that time was that if we can do it in one high school, then we can do it in all high schools. If we can do it in one elementary, we can do it in all elementaries. And part of the schools that were also selected, right, there were strategies to that. They were schools that maybe had lower outcomes or larger population of students, or over referrals to students with, to the special education testing process. And so it was kind of one of those, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. And then with that, we went back through and kind of went through those applications and talked about which portions of it we could do, right? So some of that LCAP goal work related to kind of also what the schools identified. So some of the schools proposed closing certain specialized programs. Some looked at restructuring them. Some looked at maybe building some parent education or parent ambassadors. So they kind of embedded in our different LCAP goals into their plan. Again, linking it all together. Again, we had funding tied to the schools that were selected, and part of that was promising either additional staff or additional training opportunities, things like that. So we wanted to ensure that it was all linked together. But the schools had full autonomy to create whatever plan they felt was doable and would pass kind of that longevity test, as well as obviously the main goal of impacting students in a positive way and their outcomes. But they had that flexibility. That was just another one of kind of the tethers that we had, was that it had to tie to that LCAP piece. So then the next thing that we did is kind of through that initial work is we built a blueprint for Poway specifically. So when we started this work, everybody wanted to do everything all at once, right? We wanted to fix school communities and culture. We wanted to fix their instructional design. We wanted to support their collaborative practice building. We wanted to support behavior and social emotional learning. And we quickly realized, right, you can't do it all at once. You have to target a specific area. And so part of what we built was this kind of blueprint for Poway Unified. So we identified 4 specific categories, and we kind of listed all of the different things that may fall into each category. So when we went into a school for support, like when our inclusive practices team was assigned a school, for example, what the middle school that was selected, we then picked which area we were going to target with them first. And that was done in collaboration with the staff, with the leadership. And this is a clickable link as well, so you can access this. But this is part of the conversation so that it doesn't feel as overwhelming. It doesn't feel like I'm blowing up your entire school, right? We're targeting a very specific area, again, for all students, not just students with disabilities. And so with that, it gave us all the same lens of where we wanted to see improvement. Now, the data that we tracked might be slightly different, right? There might be additional pieces that we could track depending on which areas we were targeting. Which was also helpful for us because then we weren't maybe looking at A to G rates at a high school if we were focusing on social, emotional, and behavioral. We would focus on our panoramic surveys and things like that that talk about those areas, right? So it also helped us when it came time to look at the data and look for some of those more targeted outcome improvement areas. And so this was super helpful, and we still use this 7 years later. When any team goes in to support a school site, especially if it's through the special education department, we identify which area we're looking at first. And site administrators will often use this as part of their professional learning plans for the year with their school sites. So for example, one of our school sites, Del Norte, started the year and said, hey, we're focusing on instructional design this year. Everything we do this year will be targeted to that specific area. I will not ask you to jump to these other areas until maybe next year. But this year we're focusing on instructional design. So it's even kind of expanded outside of the special education department and outside of some of our intervention teams, even on the gen ed side, and just become a tool that a lot of our administrators can use with their staff to help build some of those trusts and plans and just kind of some of that autonomy as well.
Love that. I love how you said 7 years later, it's still sitting at the center with that flexibility, right? It's very much part of that blueprint. Where are you at? Where do you need to be focusing? What can you come back to, or what do you need to move forward with? So I love it. Our next piece of our blueprint is the implementing. So how are we promoting accountability and capacity building? That is, we want to ensure that we're promoting that culture of accountability and growth beyond the leadership, throughout staff, throughout the capacity of all school staff. And deepening that learning and ongoing coaching is at the center, creating capacity and making sure we have that clear message of information across all our stakeholders, including our families and students. So I will have Michelle share some of the stuff that they did.
Yeah. So with our metrics for success, one of the biggest things is the regular check-ins. So we, with the SAI Advisory Committee Council Board, we changed the name many times. we had kind of quarterly check-ins with the schools that were identified in the beginning. So their admin came, the inclusive practices team was part of it, the program specialists that supported those sites were also part of it. And it was basically a report out, like it was holding them accountable for what they had started working on, where they were at, what they needed maybe more support with, any barriers that they were coming across. And again, it was everybody in district leadership was part of that. So if there were barriers, then there were people in the room that could help support removing some of those, right? Or finding flexible options. I would say that the number one thing that kind of came out of that repeatedly was the master scheduling piece and kind of the timeline for that. And so we would change some of our professional developments, right? We would build in some additional training. SIP even supported us. We had access to the space grant as well. And so we were able to do some additional trainings and bring that in for our administrators on how to do master schedule planning for inclusive schools because of this kind of check-in and because of these conversations that happened regularly. So it was really important to not just have a beginning of the year and an end of the year. It was those quarterly check-ins, and then in between those quarterly check-ins, we were doing learning walks at these school sites. We were pulling data. The least restrictive environment data was the number one tool that we used kind of throughout the year because it was something we could pull at a moment's notice from our IEP database. And so if they would make a change in their schedule, in their continuum, in their programming, we could pull that data immediately and see the difference. Some of the other data, right, requires end of the year kind of reporting. And so that was something that we did kind of come back to repeatedly. And then part of that too was we also tracked the students when we did close some of our special day classes, we did track those students' progress through middle school. So we closed it primarily at middle school and then elementary. And so the closure from middle school to high school was pretty consistent already. Our middle schools didn't have that specific. It was a mild to moderate special day class. They didn't have it in high school, so that was a normal trajectory for those students. So we targeted and focused on tracking the progress of the students that were in elementary, that were in that program, and then following its closure, kind of how they progressed through middle school. And amazingly enough, those students actually did better than many of the students who weren't in that program to start out with. And some of their opportunities were amazing. So again, different data points depending on kind of what each school was doing and what areas they were targeting. We also did regular progress updates. And so the link in there is to one of our board presentations. Again, our board was very supportive of this and very engaged in this. So they would join on the learning walks. They would join in a lot of these conversations with the school sites too. As the first year kind of passed and we went to an expansion phase, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the inclusive practices team became more of this targeted support. So they supported the 3 model schools to start with. That was their like main job. And then as we started to expand, they'd kind of be sent to different schools to target specific things. It might be co-teaching, it might be master schedule planning, it might be supporting instructional assistant training, right? And so they were kind of utilized more broadly in that way, which became a need for more people. So I'll talk about that too. And then the other thing that we did that you get a mixed response to is celebrations. We did banners, we did news media, we did presentations at the board, we did website presentations, or we posted everything on the website. And you have people who feel like, oh my gosh, they're acknowledging my work, right? And they appreciate what we're doing, and families are so happy, and students are having such success. Then you also have people who see that as like a bragging situation. So you have to do it in a very conscientious way. And we had to learn through that, right? There were periods of time where it was felt very, the district is presenting themselves as this way, but we see that, right, we're having trouble with this one kid in this one class. And so you have to do it in a very respectful way and a way that builds kind of the community around it. And so I just say that to say that we had learning curves with that too, on like how that celebration is done and where it should be done and where it shouldn't be done, and kind of how to do that. So then we had some different growth areas kind of with that implementation too. So it became site level support, and then we had district level support. So the site level support, this is a linkable menu that we have. Our inclusive practices team, as they grew, started building kind of a menu for sites to access them how I kind of had described. So whether it was a specific area that the principal or maybe a district leadership team was supporting a school site in something, they could reach out to the inclusive practices team, and this was kind of the areas that they supported. And so this menu was sent to all schools in the district. And then again, it was kind of a resource that was accessed as either district or site administrators identified the need. And then the next one is the district level support. So this was also done, this was done specifically for our instructional assistants. And so what we had created, again, everything's clickable, was a menu of trainings for our instructional assistants throughout the year. So our COSAs, are classified on special assignments, did targeted learnings on either our late start days or our early out days, depending on elementary, preschool, and secondary, where they allowed instructional assistants to kind of give feedback on the things they wanted training on. And so this was optional. It was recorded. It was added to all the Padlets, which I linked here for you, so that instructional assistants could access that either during the time, if that worked for their schedules, or if maybe they were being pulled somewhere else, they could access it later on. And we worked with site administrators to, do various things depending on the IA schedule. So there was some time banking that happened. There might have been some release time from the classroom that was provided. They may have, gotten them coverage for a portion of the day to be able to watch it later on if necessary. A classroom would be organized for them to be able to all sit together and zoom in on one computer screen if they were working on maybe more of a culture and community area at their school site. That would be a way to build that, right? They're going through the learning together. There was just lots of, in some cases, we timesheeted and we provided that additional funding to include those staff in that professional growth. And so kind of these two series, there was the big right site level support that was kind of the whole inclusive practices team that was determined by leadership. And then there was this kind of ongoing level of professional learning and training specifically for our instructional assistants that could be accessed right on a voluntary basis, and highly encouraged by the administrative team. And then the last one was also some additional district-wide professional learning. So we created a co-teaching series that we've been doing for, I believe, 5 years now. And it's a 4-part series, and it's throughout the school year. And it's something that we have changed the dynamic of kind of year by year. So it originally started with new co-teaching partners, and it was so that we could give them some of that foundational information. And then it went to having one partnership that was like a veteran partnership and one new partnership from a school site, so that we could, build their relationship and build some of that leadership at the school site. And then we have pendulum swung back to, we have lots of new teachers, and so we are currently providing it to all of our new pairings again. And the content is potentially different every year. So we got feedback from teachers. We go and observe other classrooms, right? There's lots of different kind of nuances to those trainings, but our department chairs and our site admin know that we will host this every year. So they know that it's something that they can sign their teachers up for to get some of that initial support.
I love that it's ongoing, right? And it still hasn't ended. And it continuously grows and improves based on the shifts in the teaching and the staff. So I love that. And our last two areas that we're going to focus on is the scaling up and sustaining. So with scaling up, we really want to look at what is that widespread application of those evidence-based practices and that stakeholder engagement. And I'm going to, for sake of time, hand that over to Michelle so she can unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So following kind of that first year of those model school sites, our next scale up was we targeted middle schools. So our middle schools became very clearly identified as the level of education that determined what happened with students next. There was a lot of different kind of variance in elementary, but depending on what classes they were in middle school, what programming they were in middle school, we could draw a direct line to where they would end up after high school and kind of what their post-secondary outcomes would be. So we targeted that. And then there was a few schools that we also targeted that needed
Yes, I forgot to put
more
it in the. Yeah, I totally
intensive
forgot.
support. Um, sorry about that, you guys. Needed some more intensive support from a district leadership lens to help address more culture. And so we identified two sites kind of over the last couple of years to do a more intensive inclusion summit is what we called it. And so Jessica's going to share some of the resources from that in the chat for you guys. And again, these were schools that maybe had already accessed our inclusion specialist team, had already accessed our program specialist, had already accessed, right, some additional PD and training, and were really struggling with that culture and community piece. And so we did a 2-day intensive visit, and we had district leadership, we had school site support, we did interviews, classroom visits, right, and came up with a very targeted plan for that school. And a lot of times this was also a school that maybe had attempted to have these conversations, but weren't able to come to consensus on things. So again, we had 2 schools only that needed to participate in this level of kind of targeted support. Then the other piece of scaling it up was making it kind of a district-wide understanding, right? We had targeted a few schools, now we were targeting middle school. We really needed to get some of this information out to everybody. And so one of our district-wide professional growth days was put on by our special education team. We had a presenter come out, Shelley Moore, is amazing. We talked about, right, instructional practices. We talked about just a community of learning and that everybody belongs, and what belonging looks like, not just being invited, but actually engaging in the space. And so that was a big piece of it. We had some professional learning teacher groups, so we call them TLCs, that were put on by some of our staff to, again, get access to additional staff who were interested in this that maybe weren't at the school sites that were being targeted at the time. And we found ways to identify and celebrate schools in a way that was receptive, that was had a positive response to our staff. So we identified schools of excellence. So these weren't necessarily the schools that we were targeting, but schools could file an application to be identified as a school of excellence, and they just had to identify kind of what they were doing and what was going above and beyond. So lots of different schools started getting identified for the amazing work that they were doing. And then we also talked about that family engagement piece. And so we started tracking that. So we got input from our parents and from our students about kind of our expanded programming and closures of the special day classes and kind of what their experiences were a few years later, and how they felt. And so we started sharing out that information as well. Like I had referred to before, our inclusive practices team grew substantially. So we went from 1 teacher and 1 instructional assistant to 3 instructional assistants, 4 teachers, and now actually we have 2 bits. So it has actually grown a little bit more too. And it expanded. So we have now adjusted and we've included preschool in our group as well. So some of those TOSAs and the bits are specific to our preschool group. But just to show you again that things change over time and nothing starts out big. It always starts out small, and you just grow, right? You just bite, you take the next bite and you just keep going. But I think part of the work too was we are a district who, similar to our students programming where we had all these separate groups, our teams at the district office also had very different groups, right? So we had a behavior support team, we had the inclusion specialists, we had the inclusive practices team, we had curriculum TOSAs, right? And so we spent a lot of time over the course of kind of the middle of this timeline trying to bridge those gaps too and bring those different teams together. Some of them were under the special education department, some of them were under our general education teams, and even in the same umbrella, right? They weren't necessarily communicating or collaborating. So that took some time also to build those bridges. So when our general ed TOSAs went out or our RTI TOSAs went out to do trainings, they would bring along someone from one of the other teams, depending on which areas they were targeting, and vice versa. So it became this great like collaborative effort. So again, it was a unanimous communication from the district's viewpoint that both sides of the house are expecting these things, which was great to see.
Thank you, Michelle. There's just so much you guys are doing that is so amazing. So lastly, I want to give this to Michelle because we are short on time, is she's going to talk about all the important elements that were essential to sustaining. What is that they did? What is Poway doing to sustain commitments in sharing the expertise, sharing the knowledge, and just really creating and championing meaningful inclusion?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So one of the things that we noticed after, I want to say, I think it was about 5 years after we started. So this is a couple years ago. We had expanded to just kind of so many different school sites, right? And different levels, elementary and secondary and preschool. And we started to realize that we all had different definitions of what inclusion meant, right? What inclusive practices for all meant. And so we spent 2 days bringing all of those groups together that I had described to come up with a unanimous understanding, definition, and to kind of realign our vision and philosophies because we had all kind of gone in different directions depending on which schools we had been a part of, right? Which work groups we had been a part of. And so that was really important for us to kind of come back together and realign and envision what we were doing and why we were here and where we were going next. The other piece is that we are lucky enough to have 2 schools that have been identified as demonstration sites for inclusive practices with SIP. And so we have a high school and we have a middle school, and they are constantly putting on visits for school sites across the state of California, which allows them opportunities to also get feedback from those districts because there are still things, again, that we are trying to improve and make better. And there's never an end. So it's just constantly trying to re-envision and make things better as students change and needs change. And so through those conversations, there are I would say questions that spark us to continue to go through kind of that revisioning cycle again. So looking at some of our learning supported classes that we still have and trying to improve those and make those our next targeted area. And so that while that's super beneficial to a bunch of people outside of the district who come to visit us, it is also just as meaningful for those administrators, and they will tell you that every time because they get to participate in those conversations and constantly kind of review where we're at. So then with Poway, like I said, we are not ever at the end. So the next for us is unique. We recently got a new superintendent and restructured all of our district leadership. And we also created a MTSS team. So that was one of the things that we identified was missing from our district overall, which made a lot of this fall on to the special education department over the years. And so we are now collaborating with a full MTSS team who has a list of targeted sites that they are piloting work at and kind of following the same pattern that we had in the way that we started, because that system works for our district. We're also restructuring kind of our inclusive practices support and team. So right now our district's focus is on preschool. We have the EAP grant, and so that is one of the focuses of that team. And so a lot of those positions have gone to support the MTSS team or have gone to support other work in the district to continue kind of continue that work and to kind of maintain it and sustain it. And then again, we're at the beginning, right? We're focusing on preschool, which is a new space. So we're kind of in that, we did that envisioning part, and now we're in that building and trying to implement part this year. And so that's why I say it's always a constant cycle of just going back and forth and kind of being in different spots at different times with different teams as you guys have your targeted spaces.
Yeah, that's such a powerful explanation of our blueprint for innovation and how fluid it is, right? It just fluctuates based on what site, what need, where you're at, and your vision for the district. So what I want to say is part of the other work that SIP grounds itself on is the research by Booth and Anscow, the Index for Inclusion, and that is that you're going to see there's these 3 elements of culture, policy, and practice in driving inclusion into true meaningful practice. And part of that sits at the center is the shared leadership. So a lot of what Michelle talked about at Poway was a constant communication and connection at all levels with shared leadership. So I'm very grateful for that. And we got to see a depiction of that as well. So with that, I want to just give us a few minutes. If you do have any questions, we're here. The the session will end in, I think, 3 or 4 minutes here, but we will be at the roundtable. Michelle and I will be there at 12:30, and we'd be happy to chat and meet with anybody. Meanwhile, feel free to connect with SIP. You can join our community and get any information, letters, or upcoming webinars or series that may be supportive for you and your LEAs. As well as in the chat, there is a couple links there for our UPK Padlet that you can connect with, especially because Michelle talked about preschool and all the wonderful work that's happening.
Yeah, I know. Works perfectly.
Okay. We've got some unmuted people. Maybe they wanted to ask a question. Okay, I'll mute them. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. If anybody does have a question, we're here for a few minutes, and I'm going to hand this over now and stop share because they're going to get you ready for your next session.
Thank you guys. It was amazing.
Thank you all.